Chapter 17 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, The Call of the Swallows. He pointed to the slip on the table. "You have seen the orders?" I nodded. "The long day's work is over. You must rejoice, for your part has been the hardest, I think. Some day you will tell me about it?" The man's face was honest and kindly, rather like that of the engineer Gaudian, whom 2 years before I had met in Germany. But his eyes fascinated me, for they were the eyes of the dreamer and fanatic who would not desist from his quest while life lasted. I thought that Ivory had chosen well in his colleague. "My task is not done yet," I said. "I came here to see Cornelius." "He will be back tomorrow evening." "Too late. I must see him at once. He has gone to Italy, and I must overtake him." "You know your duty best," he said gravely. "But you must help me. I must catch him at Santa Chiara, for it is a business of life and death. Is there a car to be had?" "There is mine, but there is no chauffeur. Cornelius took him." "I can drive myself, and I know the road, but I have no pass to cross the frontier." "That is easily supplied," he said, smiling. In one bookcase there was a shelf of dummy books. He unlocked this and revealed a small cupboard whence he took a tin dispatch box. From some papers he selected one which seemed to be already signed. "Name?" he asked. "Call me Hans Gruber of Brieg," I said. "I travel to pick up my master, who is in the timber trade." "And your return?" "I will come back by my old road," I said mysteriously, and if he knew what I meant it was more than I did myself. He completed the paper and handed it to me. "This will take you through the frontier posts. And now for the car. The servants will be in bed, for they have been preparing for a long journey, but I will myself show it you. There is enough petrol on board to take you to Rome." He led me through the hall, unlocked the front door, and we crossed the snowy lane to the garage. The place was empty, but for a great car which bore the marks of having come from muddy lowlands. To my joy I saw that it was a Daimler, a type with which I was familiar. I lit the lamp, started the engine, and ran it out on the road. "You will want an overcoat," he said. "I never wear them." "Food?" "I have some chocolate. I will breakfast at Santa Chiara." "Well, God go with you." A minute later I was tearing along the lakeside towards St. Anton village. I stopped at the cottage on the hill. Peter was not yet in bed. I found him sitting by the fire, trying to read, but I saw by his face that he had been waiting anxiously on my coming. "We're in the soup, old man," I said as I shut the door. In a dozen sentences I told him of the night's doings, of Ivory's plan, and my desperate errand. "You wanted a share," I cried. "Well, everything depends on you now. I'm off after Ivory, and God knows what will happen. Meantime, you have got to get on to Blenkiron and tell him what I've told you. He must get the news through to GHQ somehow. He must trap the wild birds before they go. I don't know how, but he must. Tell him it's all up to him and you, for I'm out of it. I must save Mary, and if God's willing, I'll settle with Ivory. But the big job is for Blenkiron and you. Somehow he has made a bad break, and the enemy has got ahead of him. He must sweat blood to make up. My God, Peter, it's the solemnest moment of our lives. I don't see any light, but we mustn't miss any chances. I'm leaving it all to you." I spoke like a man in a fever, for after what I had been through I wasn't quite sane. My coolness in the pink chalet had given place to a crazy restlessness. I can see Peter yet, standing in the ring of lamplight, supporting himself by a chair back, wrinkling his brows, and, as he always did in moments of excitement, scratching gently the tip of his left ear. His face was happy. "Never fear, Dick," he said. "It will come all right. On Salen Planbach." And then, still possessed with a demon of disquiet, I was on the road again, heading for the pass that led to Italy. The mist had gone from the sky, and the stars were shining brightly. The moon, now at the end of its first quarter, was setting in a gap of the mountains as I climbed the low col from the St. Anton valley to the greater Staubtal. There was frost, and the hard snow crackled under my wheels, but there was also that feel in the air which preludes storm. I wondered if I should run into snow in the high hills. The whole land was deep in peace. There was not a light in the hamlets I passed through, not a soul on the highway. In the Staubtal I joined the main road and swung to the left up the narrowing bed of the valley. The road was in noble condition, and the car was running finely as I mounted through forests of snowy pines to a land where the mountains crept close together and the highway coiled round the angles of great crags or skirted perilously some profound gorge with only a line of wooden posts to defend it from the void. In places the snow stood in walls on either side, where the road was kept open by man's labour. In other parts it lay thin, and in the dim light one might have fancied that one was running through open meadowlands. Slowly my head was getting clearer, and I was able to look round my problem. I banished from my mind the situation I had left behind me. Blenkiron must cope with that as best he could. It lay with him to deal with the wild birds. My job was with Ivory alone. Sometime in the early morning he would reach Santa Chiara, and there he would find Mary. Beyond that, my imagination could forecast nothing. She would be alone. I could trust his cleverness for that. He would try to force her to come with him, or he might persuade her with some lying story. Well, please God, I should come in for the tail end of the interview, and at the thought I cursed the steep gradients I was climbing, and longed for some magic to lift the Daimler beyond the summit and set it racing down the slope towards Italy. I think it was about 3:30 when I saw the lights of the frontier post. The air seemed milder than in the valleys, and there was a soft scurry of snow on my right cheek. A couple of sleepy Swiss sentries with their rifles in their hands stumbled out as I drew up. They took my pass into the hut and gave me an anxious quarter of an hour while they examined it. The performance was repeated 50 yards on, at the Italian post, where to my alarm the sentries were inclined to conversation. I played the part of the sulky servant, answering in monosyllables and pretending to immense stupidity. "You are only just in time, friend," said one in German. "The weather grows bad, and soon the pass will close. Ah, it is as cold as last winter on the Tonale. You remember, Giuseppe?" But in the end they let me move on. For a little while I felt my way gingerly, for on the summit the road had many twists and the snow was confusing to the eyes. Presently came a sharp drop and I let the Daimler go. It grew colder and I shivered a little. The snow became a wet white fog around the glowing arc of the headlights, and always the road fell, now in long curves, now in steep short dips, till I was aware of a glen opening towards the south. From long living in the wilds I have a kind of sense for landscape without the testimony of the eyes, and I knew where the ravine narrowed or widened, though it was black darkness. In spite of my restlessness I had to go slowly, for after the first rush downhill I realized that unless I was careful I might wreck the car and spoil everything. The surface of the road on the southern slope of the mountains was 1,000% worse than that on the other. I skidded and side-slipped and once grazed the edge of the gorge. It was far more maddening than the climb up, for then it had been a straightforward grind with the Daimler doing its utmost, whereas now I had to hold her back because of my own lack of skill. I reckoned that time crawling down from the summit of the Staub as some of the weariest hours I ever spent. Quite suddenly I ran out of the ill weather into a different climate. The sky was clear above me, and I saw that dawn was very near. The first pine woods were beginning, and at last came a straight slope where I could let the car out. I began to recover my spirits, which had been very dashed, and to reckon the distance I had still to travel. And then, without warning, a new world sprang up around me. Out of the blue dusk white shapes rose like ghosts, peaks and needles and domes of ice, their bases fading mistily into shadow, but the tops kindling till they glowed like jewels. I had never seen such a sight, and the wonder of it for a moment drove anxiety from my heart. More, it gave me an earnest of victory. I was in clear air once more, and surely in this diamond ether the foul things which loved the dark must be worsted. And then I saw, a mile ahead, the little square red-roofed building which I knew to be the inn of Santa Chiara. It was here that misfortune met me. I had grown careless now and looked rather at the house than the road. At one point the hillside had slipped down. It must have been recent, for the road was well kept, and I did not notice the landslide till I was on it. I slewed to the right, took too wide a curve, and before I knew, the car was over the far edge. I slapped on the brakes, but to avoid turning turtle, I had to leave the road altogether. I slithered down a steep bank into a meadow, where for my sins I ran into a fallen tree trunk with a jar that shook me out of my seat and nearly broke my arm. Before I examined the car, I knew what had happened. The front axle was bent, and the off-front wheel badly buckled. I had not time to curse my stupidity. I clambered back to the road and set off running down it at my best speed. I was mortally stiff, for Ivory's rack was not good for the joints, but I realized it only as a drag on my pace, not as an affliction in itself. My whole mind was set on the house before me and what might be happening there. There was a man at the door of the inn who, when he caught sight of my figure, began to move to meet me. I saw that it was Lancelot Wake, and the sight gave me hope. But his face frightened me. It was drawn and haggard, like one who never sleeps, and his eyes were hot coals. "Hannay," he cried, "for God's sake, what does it mean?" "Where is Mary?" I gasped, and I remember I clutched at a lapel of his coat. He pulled me to the low stone wall by the roadside. "I don't know," he said hoarsely. "We got your orders to come here this morning. We were at Chiavagno, where Blenkiron told us to wait. But last night Mary disappeared. I found she had hired a carriage and come on ahead. I followed at once and reached here an hour ago to find her gone. The woman who keeps the place is away, and there are only 2 old servants left. They tell me that Mary came here late, and that very early in the morning a closed car came over the Staub with a man in it. They say he asked to see the young lady, and that they talked together for some time, and that then she went off with him in the car down the valley. I must have passed it on my way up. There's been some black devilment that I can't follow. Who was the man? Who was the man?" He looked as if he wanted to throttle me. "I can tell you that," I said. "It was Ivory." He stared for a second as if he didn't understand. Then he leaped to his feet and cursed like a trooper. "You botched it, as I knew you would. I knew no good would come of your infernal subtleties." And he consigned me and Blenkiron and the British Army and Ivory and everybody else to the devil. I was past being angry. "Sit down, man," I said, "and listen to me." I told him of what had happened at the Pink Chalet. He heard me out with his head in his hands. The thing was too bad for cursing. "The Underground Railway," he groaned. "The thought of it drives me mad. Why are you so calm, Hannay? She's in the hands of the cleverest devil in the world, and you take it quietly. You should be a raving lunatic." "I would be, if it were any use, but I did all my raving last night in that den of Ivory's. We've got to pull ourselves together, Wake. First of all, I trust Mary to the other side of eternity. She went with him of her own free will. I don't know why, but she must have had a reason, and be sure it was a good one, for she's far cleverer than you or me. We've got to follow her somehow. Ivory's bound for Germany, but his route is by the Pink Chalet, for he hopes to pick me up there. He went down the valley, therefore he is going to Switzerland by the Mariolana. That is a long circuit, and will take him most of the day. Why he chose that way, I don't know, but there it is. We've got to get back by the Staub." "How did you come?" he asked. "That's our damnable luck. I came in a first-class 6-cylinder Daimler, which is now lying a wreck in a meadow a mile up a road. We've got to foot it." "We can't do it. It would take too long. Besides, there's the frontier to pass." I remembered ruefully that I might have got a return passport from the Portuguese Jew if I had thought of anything at that time beyond getting to Santa Chiara. "Then we must make a circuit by the hillside and dodge the guards. It's no use making difficulties, Wake. We're fairly up against it, but we've got to go on trying till we drop. Otherwise, I'll take your advice and go mad." "And supposing you get to San Anton, you'll find the house shut up and the travellers gone hours before by the Underground Railway." "Very likely, but man, there's always the glimmering of a chance. It's no good chucking in your hand till the game's out. Drop your proverbial philosophy, Mr. Martin Tupper, and look up there." He had one foot on the wall and was staring at a cleft in the snow line across the valley. The shoulder of a high peak dropped sharply to a kind of nick, and rose again in a long graceful curve of snow. All below the Nick was still in deep shadow, but from the configuration of the slopes I judged that a tributary glacier ran from it to the main glacier at the river head. "That's the Colle delle Rondini," he said, "the Col of the Swallows. It leads straight to Staubtal near Grünewald. On a good day I have done it in 7 hours, but it's not a pass for winter time. It has been done, of course, but not often. Yet, if the weather held, it might go even now, and that would bring us to St. Anton by the evening. I wonder," and he looked me over with an appraising eye, "I wonder if you're up to it." My stiffness had gone, and I burned to set my restlessness to physical toil. "If you can do it, I can," I said. "No, there you're wrong. You're a hefty fellow, but you're no mountaineer, and the ice of the Colle delle Rondini needs knowledge. It would be insane to risk it with a novice, if there were any other way, but I'm damned if I see any, and I'm going to chance it. We can get a rope and axes at the inn. Are you game?" "Right you are. 7 hours, you say? We've got to do it in 6. "You will be humbler when you get on the ice," he said grimly. "We'd better breakfast, for the Lord knows when we shall see food again." We left the inn at 5 minutes to 9, with the sky cloudless and a stiff wind from the northwest, which we felt even in the deep-cut valley. Wake walked with a long, slow stride that tried my patience. I wanted to hustle, but he bade me keep in step. "You take your orders from me, for I've been at this job before. Discipline in the ranks, remember." We crossed the river gorge by a plank bridge and worked our way up the right bank, past the moraine, to the snout of the glacier. It was bad going, for the snow concealed the boulders, and I often floundered in holes. Wake never relaxed his stride, but now and then he stopped to sniff the air. I observed that the weather looked good, and he differed. "It's too clear. There'll be a full-blown gale on the Col, and most likely snow in the afternoon." He pointed to a fat yellow cloud that was beginning to bulge over the nearest peak. After that I thought he lengthened his stride. "Lucky I had these boots resoled and nailed at Chiavagno," was the only other remark he made, till we had passed the seracs of the main glacier and turned up the lesser ice stream from the Colle delle Rondini. By 10:30 we were near its head, and I could see clearly the ribbon of pure ice between black crags too steep for snow to lie on, which was the means of ascent to the Col. The sky had clouded over, and ugly streamers floated on the high slopes. We tied on the rope at the foot of the Bergschrund, which was easy to pass because of the winter's snow. Wake led, of course, and presently we came onto the ice fall. In my time I had done a lot of scrambling on rocks, and used to promise myself a season in the Alps to test myself on the big peaks. If I ever go, it will be to climb the honest rock towers around Chamonix, for I won't have anything to do with snow mountains. That day on the Colle delle Rondini fairly sickened me of ice. I dare say I might have liked it if I had done it in a holiday mood, at leisure and in good spirits. But to crawl up that couloir with a sick heart and a desperate impulse to hurry was the worst of nightmares. The place was as steep as a wall of smooth black ice that seemed hard as granite. Wake did the step-cutting, and I admired him enormously. He did not seem to use much force, but every step was hewn clearly, the right size, and they were spaced the right distance. In this job he was the true professional. I was thankful Blenkiron was not with us, for the thing would have given a squirrel vertigo. The chips of ice slithered between my legs, and I could watch them till they brought up just above the Bergschrund. The ice was in shadow, and it was bitterly cold. As we crawled up, I had not the exercise of using the axe to warm me, and I got very numb standing on one leg waiting for the next step. Worse still, my legs began to cramp. I was in good condition, but that time under Ivory's rack had played the mischief with my limbs. Muscles had got out of place in my calves, and stood in aching lumps till I almost squealed with the pain of it. I was mortally afraid I should slip, and every time I moved I called out to Wake to warn him. He saw what was happening and got the pick of his axe fixed in the ice before I was allowed to stir. He spoke often to cheer me up, and his voice had none of its harshness. He was like some ill-tempered generals I have known, very gentle in a battle. At the end the snow began to fall, a soft powder like the overspill of a storm raging beyond the crest. It was just after that Wake cried out that in 5 minutes we would be at the summit. He consulted his wristwatch. "Jolly good time, too. Only 25 minutes behind my best. It's not 1 o'clock." The next I knew I was lying flat on a pad of snow, easing my cramped legs, while Wake shouted in my ear that we were in for something bad. I was aware of a driving blizzard, but I had no thought of anything but the blessed relief from pain. I lay for some minutes on my back with my legs stiff in the air and the toes turned inwards, while my muscles fell into their proper place. It was certainly no spot to linger in. We looked down into a trough of driving mist, which sometimes swirled aside and showed a knuckle of black rock far below. We ate some chocolate while Wake shouted in my ear that now we had less step-cutting. He did his best to cheer me, but he could not hide his anxiety. Our faces were frosted over like a wedding cake, and the sting of the wind was like a whiplash on our eyelids. The first part was easy, down a slope of firm snow where steps were not needed. Then came ice again, and we had to cut into it below the fresh surface snow. This was so laborious that Wake took to the rocks on the right side of the couloir, where there was some shelter from the main force of the blast. I found it easier, for I knew something about rocks, but it was difficult enough with every handhold and foothold glazed. Presently we were driven back again to the ice, and painfully cut our way through a throat of the ravine where the sides narrowed. There the wind was terrible, for the narrows made a kind of funnel, and we descended, plastered against the wall, and scarcely able to breathe, while the tornado plucked at our bodies as if it would whisk us like wisps of grass into the abyss. After that the gorge widened, and we had an easier slope, till suddenly we found ourselves perched on a great tongue of rock, round which the snow blew like the froth in a whirlpool. As we stopped for breath, Wake shouted in my ear that this was the Black Stone. "The what?" I yelled. "The Schwarzstein. The Swiss call the pass the Schwarzstein-Tor. You can see it from Grünewald." I suppose every man has a tinge of superstition in him. To hear that name in that ferocious place gave me a sudden access of confidence. I seemed to see all my doings as part of a great predestined plan. Surely it was not for nothing that the word which had been the key of my first adventure in the long tussle should appear in this last phase. I felt new strength in my legs and more vigour in my lungs. "A good omen," I shouted. "Wake, old man, we're going to win out." "The worst is still to come," he said. He was right. To get down that tongue of rock to the lower snows of the couloir was a job that fairly brought us to the end of our tether. I can feel yet the sour, bleak smell of wet rock and ice, and the hard nerve pain that racked my forehead. The Kaffirs used to say that there were devils in the High Berg, and this place was assuredly given over to the powers of the air who had no thought of human life. I seemed to be in the world which had endured from the eternity before man was dreamed of. There was no mercy in it, and the elements were pitting their immortal strength against two pygmies who had profaned their sanctuary. I yearned for warmth, for the glow of a fire, for a tree or a blade of grass or anything which meant the sheltered homeliness of mortality. I knew then what the Greeks meant by panic, for I was scared by the apathy of nature. But the terror gave me a kind of comfort too. Ivory and his doings seemed less formidable. Let me but get out of this cold hell, and I could meet him with a new confidence. Wake led, for he knew the road, and the road wanted knowing. Otherwise he would have been last on the rope, for that is the place of the better man in a descent. I had some horrible moments following on when the rope grew taut, for I had no help from it. We zigzagged down the rock, sometimes driven to the ice of the adjacent couloirs, sometimes on the outer ridge of the Black Stone, sometimes wriggling down little cracks and over evil boiler plates. The snow did not lie on it, but the rock crackled with thin ice or oozed ice water. Often it was only by the grace of God that I did not fall headlong and pull Wake out of his hold to the bergschrund far below. I slipped more than once, but always by a miracle recovered myself. To make matters worse, Wake was tiring. I could feel him drag on the rope, and his movements had not the precision they had had in the morning. He was the mountaineer, and I was the novice. If he gave out, we should never reach the valley. The fellow was clear grit all through. When we reached the foot of the tooth and sat huddled up with our faces away from the wind, I saw that he was on the edge of fainting. What that effort must have cost him in the way of resolution, you may guess, but he did not fail till the worst was past. His lips were colourless, and he was choking with the nausea of fatigue. I found a flask of brandy in his pocket, and a mouthful revived him. "I'm all out," he said. "The road's easier now, and I can direct you about the rest. You'd better leave me. I'll only be a drag. I'll come on when I feel better." "No, you don't, you old fool. You got me over that infernal iceberg, and I'm going to see you home." I rubbed his arms and legs and made him swallow some chocolate, but when he got on his feet he was as doddery as an old man. Happily we had an easy course down a snow gradient, which we glissaded in very unorthodox style. The swift motion freshened him up a little, and he was able to put on the brake with his axe to prevent us cascading into the Bergschrund. We crossed it by a snow bridge and started out on the seracs of the Schwarzstein glacier. I am no mountaineer, not of the snow and ice kind anyway, but I have a big share of physical strength, and I wanted it all now. For those seracs were an invention of the devil. To traverse that labyrinth in a blinding snowstorm with a fainting companion who was too weak to jump the narrowest crevasse, and who hung on the rope like lead when there was occasion to use it, was more than I could manage. Besides, every step that brought us nearer to the valley now increased my eagerness to hurry, and wandering in that maze of clotted ice was like the nightmare when you stand on the rails with the express coming and are too weak to climb onto the platform. As soon as possible I left the glacier for the hillside, and though that was laborious enough in all conscience, yet it enabled me to steer a straight course. Wake never spoke a word. When I looked at him his face was ashen under a gale which should have made his cheeks glow, and he kept his eyes half closed. He was staggering on at the very limits of his endurance. By and by we were on the moraine, and after splashing through a dozen little glacier streams, came on a track which led up the hillside. Wake nodded feebly when I asked him if this was right. Then, to my joy, I saw a gnarled pine. I untied the rope, and Wake dropped like a log on the ground. "Leave me," he groaned. "I'm fairly done. I'll come on later." And he shut his eyes. My watch told me that it was after 5 o'clock. "Get on my back," I said. "I won't part from you till I've found a cottage. You're a hero. You brought me over those damned mountains in a blizzard, and that's what no other man in England would have done. Get up." He obeyed, for he was too far gone to argue. I tied his wrists together with a handkerchief below my chin, for I wanted my arms to hold up his legs. The rope and axes I left in a cache beneath the pine tree. Then I started trotting down the track for the nearest dwelling. My strength felt inexhaustible, and the quicksilver in my bones drove me forward. The snow was still falling, but the wind was dying now, and after the inferno of the pass it was like summer. The road wound over the shale of the hillside, and then into what in spring must have been upland meadows. Then it ran among trees, and far below me on the right I could hear the glacier river churning in its gorge. Soon little empty huts appeared, and rough enclosed paddocks, and presently I came out on a shelf above the stream and smelt the wood smoke of a human habitation. I found a middle-aged peasant at the cottage, a guide by profession in summer and a woodcutter in winter. "I have brought my Herr from Santa Chiara," I said, "over the Schwarzstein Tor. He is very weary and must sleep." I decanted Wake into a chair, and his head nodded on his chest, but his colour was better. "You and your Herr are fools," said the man gruffly, but not unkindly. "He must sleep or he will have a fever. The Schwarzstein Tor in this devil's weather. Is he English?" "Yes," I said, "like all madmen. But he's a good Herr and a brave mountaineer." We stripped Wake of his Red Cross uniform, now a collection of sopping rags, and got him between blankets with the huge earthenware bottle of hot water at his feet. The woodcutter's wife boiled milk, and this with a little brandy added, we made him drink. I was quite easy in my mind about him, for I had seen this condition before. In the morning he would be as stiff as a poker, but recovered. "Now I'm off for St. Anton," I said. "I must get there tonight." "You are the hardy one," the man laughed. "I will show you the quick road to Grünewald, where is the railway. With good fortune you may get the last train." I gave him 50 francs on my Herr's behalf. learned his directions for the road, and set off after a draught of goat's milk, munching my last slab of chocolate. I was still strung up to a mechanical activity, and I ran every inch of the 3 miles to the Staubtal without consciousness of fatigue. I was 20 minutes too soon for the train, and as I sat on a bench on the platform, my energy suddenly ebbed away. That is what happens after a great exertion. I longed to sleep, and when the train arrived I crawled into a carriage like a man with a stroke. There seemed to be no force left in my limbs. I realized that I was leg-weary, which is a thing you see sometimes with horses, but not often with men. All the journey I lay like a log in a kind of coma, and it was with difficulty I recognized my destination and stumbled out of the train. But I had no sooner emerged from the station of St. Anton than I got my second wind. Much snow had fallen since yesterday, but it had stopped now, the sky was clear, and the moon was riding. The sight of the familiar place brought back all my anxieties. The day on the Col of the Swallows was wiped out of my memory, and I saw only the inn at Santa Chiara, and heard Wake's hoarse voice speaking of Mary. The lights were twinkling from the village below, and on the right I saw the clump of trees which held the pink chalet. I took a short cut across the fields, avoiding the little town. I ran hard, stumbling often, for though I had got my mental energy back, my legs were still precarious. The station clock had told me that it was nearly 9:30. Soon I was on the high road, and then at the chalet gates. I heard as in a dream what seemed to be 3 shrill blasts on a whistle. Then a big car passed me, making for St. Anton. For a second I would have hailed it, but it was past me and away. But I have a conviction that my business lay in the house, for I thought Ivory was there, and Ivory was what mattered. I marched up the drive with no sort of plan in my head, only a blind rushing on fate. I remembered dimly that I had still 3 cartridges in my revolver. The front door stood open, and I entered and tiptoed down the passage to the room where I had found the Portuguese Jew. No one hindered me, but it was not for lack of servants. I had the impression that there were people near me in the darkness, and I thought I heard German softly spoken. There was someone ahead of me, perhaps the speaker, for I could hear careful footsteps. It was very dark, but a ray of light came from below the door of the room. Then behind me I heard the hall door clang, and the noise of a key turned in its lock. I had walked straight into a trap, and all retreat was cut off. My mind was beginning to work more clearly, though my purpose was still vague. I wanted to get at Ivory, and I believed that he was somewhere in front of me. And then I thought of the door which led from the chamber where I had been imprisoned. If I could enter that way, I would have the advantage of surprise. I groped on the right hand of the passage and found a handle. It opened upon what seemed to be a dining room, for there was a faint smell of food. Again I had the impression of people near who for some unknown reason did not molest me. At the far end I found another door, which led to a second room, which I guessed to be adjacent to the library. Beyond it again must lie the passage from the chamber with the rack. The whole place was as quiet as a shell. I had guessed right. I was standing in the passage where I had stood the night before. In front of me was the library, and there was the same chink of light showing. Very softly I turned the handle and opened it a crack. The first thing that caught my eye was the profile of Ivory. He was looking towards the writing table where someone was sitting. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, The Underground Railway. This is the story which I heard later from Mary. She was at Milan with the new Anglo-American hospital when she got Blenkiron's letter. Santa Chiara had always been the place agreed upon, and this message mentioned specifically Santa Chiara and fixed a date for her presence there. She was a little puzzled by it, for she had not yet had a word from Ivory, to whom she had written twice by the roundabout address in France which Bommaerts had given her. She did not believe that he would come to Italy in the ordinary course of things, and she wondered at Blenkiron's certainty about the date. The following morning came a letter from Ivery, in which he ardently pressed for a meeting. It was the first of several, full of strange talk about some approaching crisis, in which the forebodings of the prophet were mingled with the solicitude of a lover. "The storm is about to break," he wrote, "and I cannot think only of my own fate. I have something to tell you which vitally concerns yourself. You say you are in Lombardy. The Chiavagno valley is within easy reach, and at its head is the inn of Santa Chiara, to which I come on the morning of March 19th. Meet me there, even if only for half an hour, I implore you. We have already shared hopes and confidences, and I would now share with you a knowledge which I alone in Europe possess. You have the heart of a lion, my lady, worthy of what I can bring you." Wake was summoned from the Croce Rossa unit with which he was working at Vicenza, and the plan arranged by Blenkiron was faithfully carried out. 4 officers of the Alpini, in the rough dress of peasants of the hills, met them in Chiavagno on the morning of the 18th. It was arranged that the hostess of Santa Chiara should go on a visit to her sister's son, leaving the inn, now in the shuttered quiet of winter time, under the charge of 2 ancient servants. The hour of Ivery's coming on the 19th had been fixed by him for noon, and that morning Mary would drive up the valley, while Wake and the Alpini went inconspicuously by other routes so as to be in station around the place before midday. But on the evening of the 18th, at the Hotel of the Four Kings in Chiavagno, Mary received another message. It was from me, and told her that I was crossing the Staub at midnight and would be at the inn before dawn. It begged her to meet me there, to meet me alone without the others, because I had that to say to her which must be said before Ivery's coming. I have seen the letter. It was written in a hand which I could not have distinguished from my own scrawl. It was not exactly what I would myself have written, but there were phrases in it which to Mary's mind could have come only from me. Oh, I admit it was cunningly done, especially the love-making, which was just the kind of stammering thing which I would have achieved if I had tried to put my feelings on paper. Anyhow, Mary had no doubt of its genuineness. She slipped off after dinner, hired a carriage with 2 broken-winded screws, and set off up the valley. She left a line for Wake, telling him to follow according to the plan, a line which he never got, for his anxiety when he found she had gone drove him to immediate pursuit. At about 2 in the morning of the 19th, after a slow and icy journey, she arrived at the inn, knocked up the aged servants, made herself a cup of chocolate out of her tea-basket, and sat down to wait on my coming. She has described to me that time of waiting. A home-made candle in a tall earthenware candlestick lit up the little salle à manger, which was the one room in use. The world was very quiet, the snow muffled the roads, and it was cold with the penetrating chill of the small hours of a March night. Always, she has told me, will the taste of chocolate and the smell of burning tallow bring back to her that strange place and the flutter of the heart with which she waited. For she was on the eve of the crisis of all our labours. She was very young, and youth has a quick fancy which will not be checked. Moreover, it was I who was coming, and save for the scrawl of the night before, we had had no communication for many weeks. She tried to distract her mind by repeating poetry, and the thing that came into her head was Keats's Nightingale, an odd poem for the time and place. There was a long wicker chair among the furnishings of the room, and she lay down on it with her fur cloak muffled around her. There were sounds of movement in the inn. The old woman who had let her in, with the scent of intrigue of her kind, had brightened when she heard that another guest was coming. Beautiful women do not travel at midnight for nothing. She also was awake and expectant. Then quite suddenly came the sound of a car slowing down outside. She sprang to her feet in a tremor of excitement. It was like the Picardy chateau again, the dim room and a friend coming out of the night. She heard the front door open and a step in the little hall. She was looking at Ivery. He slipped his driving coat off as he entered and bowed gravely. He was wearing a green hunting suit, which in the dusk seemed like khaki, and as he was about my own height, for a second she was misled. Then she saw his face and her heart stopped. "You!" she cried. She had sunk back again on the wicker chair. "I have come as I promised," he said, "but a little earlier. You will forgive my eagerness to be with you." She did not heed his words, for her mind was feverishly busy. My letter had been a fraud, and this man had discovered our plans. She was alone with him, for it would be hours before her friends came from Chiavagno. He had the game in his hands, and of all our confederacy she alone remained to confront him. Mary's courage was pretty near perfect, and for the moment she did not think of herself or her own fate. That came later. She was possessed with poignant disappointment at our failure. All our efforts had gone to the winds, and the enemy had won with contemptuous ease. Her nervousness disappeared before the intense regret, and her brain set coolly and busily to work. It was a new Ivory who confronted her, a man with vigour and purpose in every line of him, and the quiet confidence of power. He spoke with a serious courtesy. "The time for make-believe is past," he was saying. "We have fenced with each other. I have told you only half the truth, and you have always kept me at arm's length. But you knew in your heart, my dearest lady, that there must be the full truth between us some day, and that day has come. I have often told you that I love you. I do not come now to repeat that declaration. I come to ask you to entrust yourself to me, to join your fate to mine, for I can promise you the happiness which you deserve." He pulled up a chair and sat beside her. I cannot put down all that he said, for Mary, once she grasped the drift of it, was busy with her own thoughts and did not listen. But I gather from her that he was very candid, and seemed to grow as he spoke in mental and moral stature. He told her who he was and what his work had been. He claimed the same purpose as hers, a hatred of war and a passion to rebuild the world into decency. But now he drew a different moral. He was a German. It was through Germany alone that peace and regeneration could come. His country was purged from her faults, and the marvellous German discipline was about to prove itself in the eye of gods and men. He told her what he had told me in the room at the Pink Chalet, but with another colouring. Germany was not vengeful or vainglorious, only patient and merciful. God was about to give her the power to decide the world's fate, and it was for him and his kind to see that the decision was beneficent. The greater task of his people was only now beginning. That was the gist of his talk. She appeared to listen, but her mind was far away. She must delay him for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. If not, she must keep beside him. She was the only one of our company left in touch with the enemy. "I go to Germany now," he was saying. "I want you to come with me, to be my wife." He waited for an answer, and got it in the form of a startled question. "To Germany? How?" "It is easy," he said, smiling. "The car which is waiting outside is the first stage of a system of travel which we have perfected." Then he told her about the Underground Railway, not as he had told it to me, to scare, but as a proof of power and forethought. His manner was perfect. He was respectful, devoted, thoughtful of all things. He was the suppliant, not the master. He offered her power and pride, a dazzling career, for he had deserved well of his country, the devotion of the faithful lover. He would take her to his mother's house, where she would be welcomed like a princess. I have no doubt he was sincere, for he had many moods, and the libertine whom he had revealed to me at the Pink Chalet had given way to the honourable gentleman. He could play all parts well, because he could believe in himself in them all. Then he spoke of danger, not so as to slight her courage, but to emphasize his own thoughtfulness. The world in which he had lived was crumbling, and he alone could offer a refuge. She felt the steel gauntlet through the texture of the velvet glove. All the while she had been furiously thinking, with her chin in her hand in the old way. She might refuse to go. He could compel her, no doubt, for there was no help to be got from the old servants. But it might be difficult to carry an unwilling woman over the first stages of the Underground Railway. There might be chances. Supposing he accepted her refusal and left her, then indeed he would be gone for ever, and our game would have closed with a fiasco. The great antagonist of England would go home rejoicing, taking his sheaves with him. At this time she had no personal fear of him. So curious a thing is the human heart, that her main preoccupation was with our mission, not with her own fate. To fail utterly seemed too bitter. Supposing she went with him? They had still to get out of Italy and cross Switzerland. If she were with him, she would be an emissary of the Allies in the enemy's camp. She asked herself what she could do, and told herself nothing. She felt like a small bird in a very large trap, and her chief sensation was that of her own powerlessness. But she had learned Blenkiron's gospel, and knew that heaven sends amazing chances to the bold. And even as she made her decision, she was aware of a dark shadow lurking at the back of her mind, the shadow of the fear which she knew was awaiting her. For she was going into the unknown with a man whom she hated, a man who claimed to be her lover. It was the bravest thing I have ever heard of, and I have lived my life among brave men. "I will come with you," she said, "but you mustn't speak to me, please. I am tired and troubled, and I want peace to think." As she rose, weakness came over her, and she swayed till his arm caught her. "I wish I could let you rest for a little," he said tenderly, "but time presses. The car runs smoothly, and you can sleep there." He summoned one of the servants, to whom he handed Mary. "We leave in 10 minutes," he said, and he went out to see to the car. Mary's first act in the bedroom to which she was taken was to bathe her eyes and brush her hair. She felt dimly that she must keep her head clear. Her second was to scribble a note to Wake, telling him what had happened, and to give it to the servant with a tip. "The gentleman will come in the morning," she said. "You must give it to him at once, for it concerns the fate of your country." The woman grinned and promised. It was not the first time she had done errands for pretty ladies. Ivory settled her in the great closed car with much solicitude, and made her comfortable with rugs. Then he went back to the inn for a second, and she saw a light in the salle à manger. He returned and spoke to the driver in German, taking his seat beside him. But first he handed Mary her note to Wake. "I think you left this behind you," he said. He had not opened it. Alone in the car, Mary slept. She saw the figures of Ivory and the chauffeur in the front seat, dark against the headlights, and then they dislimned into dreams. She had undergone a greater strain than she knew, and was sunk in the heavy sleep of the weary nerves. When she woke, it was daylight. They were still in Italy, as her first glance told her, so they could not have taken the Staub route. They seemed to be among the foothills, for there was little snow, but now and then, up tributary valleys, she had glimpses of the high peaks. She tried hard to think what it could mean, and then remembered the Mariolana. Wake had laboured to instruct her in the topography of the Alps, and she had grasped the fact of the 2 open passes. But the Mariolana meant a big circuit, and they would not be in Switzerland till the evening. They would arrive in the dark, and pass out of it in the dark, and there would be no chance of succour. She felt very lonely and very weak. Throughout the morning her fear grew. The more hopeless her chance of defeating Ivory became, the more insistently the dark shadow crept over her mind. She tried to steady herself by watching the show from the windows. The car swung through little villages, past vineyards and pine woods, and the blue of lakes, and over the gorges of mountain streams. There seemed to be no trouble about passports. The sentries at the controls waved a reassuring hand when they were shown some card which the chauffeur held between his teeth. In one place there was a longish halt, and she could hear Ivory talking Italian with 2 officers of Bersaglieri, to whom he gave cigars. They were fresh-faced, upstanding boys, and for a second she had an idea of flinging open the door and appealing to them to save her. But that would have been futile, for Ivory was clearly amply certificated. She wondered what part he was now playing. The Mariolana route had been chosen for a purpose. In one town Ivory met and talked to a civilian official, and more than once the car slowed down and someone appeared from the wayside to speak a word and vanish. She was assisting at the last gathering up of the threads of a great plan before the wild birds returned to their nest. Most of these conferences seemed to be in Italian, but once or twice she gathered from the movement of the lips that German was spoken, and that this rough peasant or that black-booted bourgeois was not of Italian blood. Early in the morning, soon after she awoke, Ivory had stopped the car and offered her a well-provided luncheon basket. She could eat nothing, and watched him breakfast off sandwiches beside the driver. In the afternoon he asked her permission to sit with her. The car drew up in a lonely place, and a tea basket was produced by the chauffeur. Ivory made tea, for she seemed too listless to move, and she drank a cup with him. After that he remained beside her. "In half an hour we shall be out of Italy," he said. The car was running up a long valley to the curious hollow between snowy saddles, which is the crest of the Majolana. He showed her the place on a road map. As the altitude increased and the air grew colder, he wrapped the rugs closer around her and apologized for the absence of a foot warmer. "In a little," he said, "we shall be in the land where your slightest wish will be law." She dozed again, and so missed the frontier post. When she woke, the car was slipping down the long curves of the Weiss Valley before it narrows to the gorge through which it debouches on Grünewald. "We are in Switzerland now," she heard his voice say. It may have been fancy, but it seemed to her that there was a new note in it. He spoke to her with the assurance of possession. They were outside the country of the Allies, and in a land where his web was thickly spread. "Where do we stop tonight?" she asked timidly. "I fear we cannot stop. Tonight also you must put up with the car. I have a little errand to do on the way, which will delay us a few minutes, and then we press on. Tomorrow, my fairest one, fatigue will be ended." There was no mistake now about the note of possession in his voice. Mary's heart began to beat fast and wild. The trap had closed down on her, and she saw the folly of her courage. It had delivered her bound and gagged into the hands of one whom she loathed more deeply every moment, whose proximity was less welcome than a snake's. She had to bite hard on her lip to keep from screaming. The weather had changed and it was snowing hard, the same storm that had greeted us on the Col of the Swallows. The pace was slower now, and Ivory grew restless. He looked frequently at his watch and snatched the speaking tube to talk to the driver. Mary caught the word St. Anton. "Do we go by St. Anton?" she found a voice to ask. "Yes," he said shortly. The word gave her the faintest glimmering of hope, for she knew that Peter and I had lived at St. Anton. She tried to look out of the blurred window, but could see nothing except that twilight was falling. She begged for the road map, and saw that so far as she could make out, they were still in the broad Grünewald valley, and that to reach St. Anton they had to cross the low pass from the Staubtal. The snow was still drifting thick, and the car crawled. Then she felt the rise as they mounted to the pass. Here the going was bad, very different from the dry frost in which I had covered the same road the night before. Moreover, there seemed to be curious obstacles. Some careless woodcart had dropped logs on the highway, and more than once both Ivory and the chauffeur had to get out to shift them. In one place there had been a small landslide, which left little room to pass, and Mary had to descend and cross on foot while the driver took the car over alone. Ivory's temper seemed to be souring. To the girl's relief he resumed the outside seat, where he was engaged in constant argument with the chauffeur. At the head of the pass stands an inn, the comfortable hostelry of Herr Kronig, well known to all who clamber among the lesser peaks of the Staubtal. There in the middle of the way stood a man with a lantern. "The road is blocked by a snowfall," he cried. "They are clearing it now. It will be ready in half an hour's time." Ivory sprang from his seat and darted into the hotel. His business was to speed up the clearing party, and Herr Kronig himself accompanied him to the scene of the catastrophe. Mary sat still, for she had suddenly become possessed of an idea. She drove it from her as foolishness, but it kept returning. Why had those tree trunks been spilt on the road? Why had an easy pass after a moderate snowfall suddenly been closed? A man came out of the inn-yard and spoke to the chauffeur. It seemed to be an offer of refreshment, for the latter left his seat and disappeared inside. He was away for some time and returned shivering and grumbling at the weather, with the collar of his greatcoat turned up around his ears. A lantern had been hung in the porch, and as he passed, Mary saw the man. She had been watching the back of his head idly during the long drive, and had observed that it was of the round bullet type, with no nape to the neck, which is common in the fatherland. Now she could not see his neck for the coat collar, but she could have sworn that the head was a different shape. The man seemed to suffer acutely from the cold, for he buttoned the collar around his chin and pulled his cap far over his brows. Ivery came back, followed by a dragging line of men with spades and lanterns. He flung himself into the front seat and nodded to the driver to start. The man had his engine going already so as to lose no time. He bumped over the rough debris of the snowfall and then fairly let the car hum. Ivery was anxious for speed, but he did not want his neck broken, and he yelled out to take care. The driver nodded and slowed down, but presently he had got up speed again. If Ivery was restless, Mary was worse. She seemed suddenly to have come on the traces of her friends. In the St. Anton valley the snow had stopped, and she let down the window for air, for she was choking with suspense. The car rushed past the station, down the hill by Peter's cottage, through the village and along the lake shore to the Pink Chalet. Ivery halted it at the gate. "See that you fill up with petrol," he told the man. "Bid Gustav get the Daimler and be ready to follow in half an hour." He spoke to Mary through the open window. "I will keep you only a very little time. I think you had better wait in the car, for it will be more comfortable than a dismantled house. A servant will bring you food and more rugs for the night journey." Then he vanished up the dark avenue. Mary's first thought was to slip out and get back to the village, and there to find someone who knew me, but could take her where Peter lived. But the driver would prevent her, for he had been left behind on guard. She looked anxiously at his back, for he alone stood between her and liberty. That gentleman seemed to be intent on his own business. As soon as Ivery's footsteps had grown faint, he had backed the car into the entrance and turned it so that it faced towards St. Anton. Then, very slowly, it began to move. At the same moment a whistle was blown shrilly 3 times. The door on the right had opened, and someone who had been waiting in the shadows climbed painfully in. Mary saw that it was a little man, and that he was a cripple. She reached out a hand to help him, and he fell on the cushions beside her. The car was gathering speed. Before she realized what was happening, the newcomer had taken her hand and was patting it. About 2 minutes later, I was entering the gate of the Pink Chalet. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Mr. Standfast by John Buchan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, The Cage of the Wild Birds. "Why, Mr. Ivery, come right in," said the voice at the table. There was a screen before me, stretching from the fireplace to keep off the draught from the door by which I had entered. It stood higher than my head, but there were cracks in it through which I could watch the room. I found a little table on which I could lean my back, for I was dropping with fatigue. Blenkiron sat at the writing table, and in front of him were little rows of patience cards. Wood ashes still smouldered in the stove, and a lamp stood at his right elbow which lit up the 2 figures. The bookshelves and the cabinets were in twilight. "I've been hoping to see you for quite a time." Blenkiron was busy arranging the little heaps of cards, and his face was wreathed in hospitable smiles. I remember wondering why he should play the host to the true master of the house. Ivery stood erect before him. He was a rather splendid figure now that he had sloughed off all disguises, and was on the threshold of his triumph. Even through the fog in which my brain worked, it was forced upon me that here was a man born to play a big part. He had a jowl like a Roman king on a coin, and scornful eyes that were used to mastery. He was younger than me, confound him, and now he looked it. He kept his eyes on the speaker, while a little smile played round his mouth, a very ugly smile. "So," he said, "we have caught the old crow too. I had scarcely hoped for such good fortune, and to speak the truth I had not concerned myself much about you. But now we shall add you to the bag. And what a bag of vermin to lay out on the lawn!" He flung back his head and laughed. "Mr. Ivery," Blenkiron began, but was cut short. "Drop that name. All that is past, thank God. I am the Graf von Schwabing, an officer of the Imperial Guard. I am not the least of the weapons that Germany has used to break her enemies." "You don't say," drawled Blenkiron, still fiddling with his patience cards. The man's moment had come, and he was minded not to miss a jot of his triumph. His figure seemed to expand, his eye kindled, his voice rang with pride. It was melodrama of the best kind, and he fairly rolled it round his tongue. I don't think I grudged it him, for I was fingering something in my pocket. He had won all right, but he wouldn't enjoy his victory long, for soon I would shoot him. I had my eye on the very spot above his right ear where I meant to put my bullet. For I was very clear that to kill him was the only way to protect Mary. I feared the whole 70 millions of Germany less than this man. That was the single idea that remained firm against the immense fatigue that pressed down on me. "I have little time to waste on you," said he who had been called Ivory, "but I will spare a moment to tell you a few truths. Your childish game never had a chance. I played with you in England, and I have played with you ever since. You have never made a move, but I have quietly counted it. Why, man, you gave me your confidence. The American, Mr. Dunn." "What about Clarence?" asked Blenkiron. His face seemed to study in pure bewilderment. "I was that interesting journalist." "Now, to think of that," said Blenkiron in a sad, gentle voice. "I thought I was safe with Clarence. Why, he brought me a letter from old Joe Hooper, and he knew all the boys down Emporia way." Ivory laughed. "You have never done me justice, I fear, but I think you will do it now. Your gang is helpless in my hands. General Hannay," and I wish I could give you a notion of the scorn with which he pronounced the word general. "Yes, Dick?" said Blenkiron intently. "He has been my prisoner for 24 hours, and the pretty Miss Mary too. You are all going with me in a little to my own country. You will not guess how. We call it the Underground Railway, and you will have the privilege of studying its working. I had not troubled much about you, for I had no special dislike of you. You are only a blundering fool, what you call in your country easy fruit." "I thank you, Graf," Blenkiron said solemnly. "But since you are here, you will join the others. One last word. To beat inepts such as you is nothing. There is a far greater thing. My country has conquered. You and your friends will be dragged at the chariot wheels of a triumph such as Rome never saw. Does that penetrate your thick skull? Germany has won, and in 2 days the whole round earth will be stricken dumb by her greatness." As I watched Blenkiron, a grey shadow of hopelessness seemed to settle on his face. His big body drooped in his chair, his eyes fell, and his left hand shuffled limply among his patience cards. I could not get my mind to work, but I puzzled miserably over his amazing blunders. He had walked blindly into the pit his enemies had dug for him. Peter must have failed to get my message to him, and he knew nothing of last night's work or my mad journey to Italy. We had all bungled, the whole wretched bunch of us, Peter and Blenkiron and myself. I had a feeling at the back of my head that there was something in it all I couldn't understand, that the catastrophe could not be quite as simple as it seemed. But I had no power to think, with the insolent figure of Ivory dominating the room. Thank God I had a bullet waiting for him. That was the one fixed point in the chaos of my mind. For the first time in my life I was resolute on killing one particular man, and the purpose gave me a horrid comfort. Suddenly Ivory's voice rang out sharp. "Take your hand out of your pocket. You fool, you are covered from 3 points in the walls. A movement and my men will make a sieve of you. Others before you have sat in that chair, and I am used to take precautions. Quick, both hands on the table." There was no mistake about Blenkiron's defeat. He was done and out, and I was left with the only card. He leaned wearily on his arms, with his palms of his hands spread out. "I reckon you've got a strong hand, Graf," he said, and his voice was flat with despair. "I hold a royal flush," was the answer. And then suddenly came a change. Blenkiron raised his head, and his sleepy, ruminating eyes looked straight at Ivory. "I call you," he said. I didn't believe my ears, nor did Ivory. "The hour for bluff is past," he said. "Nevertheless, I call you." At that moment I felt someone squeeze through the door behind me and take his place at my side. The light was so dim that I saw only a short, square figure, but a familiar voice whispered in my ear, "It's me, Andra Amos. Man, this is a great ploy. I'm here to see the end of it. No prisoner waiting on the finding of the jury, no commander expecting news of a great battle, ever hung in more desperate suspense than I did during the next seconds. I had forgotten my fatigue. My back no longer needed support. I kept my eyes glued to the crack in the screen, and my ears drank in greedily every syllable. Blenkiron was now sitting bolt upright with his chin in his hands. There was no shadow of melancholy in his lean face. "I say, I call you Herr Graf von Schwabing. I'm going to put you wise about some little things. You don't carry arms, so I needn't warn you against monkeying with a gun. You're right in saying that there are 3 places in these walls from which you can shoot. Well, for your information, I may tell you that there's guns in all 3, but they're covering you at this moment, so you'd better be good." Ivery sprang to attention like a ramrod. "Karl!" he cried. "Gustav!" As if by magic, figures stood on either side of him, like warders by a criminal. They were not the sleek German footmen whom I had seen at the chalet. One I did not recognize. The other was my servant, Geordie Hamilton. He gave them one glance, looked round like a hunted animal, and then steadied himself. The man had his own kind of courage. "I've gotten something to say to you," Blenkiron drawled. "It's been a tough fight, but I reckon the hot end of the poker is with you. I compliment you on Clarence Dunn. You fooled me fine over that business, and it was only by the mercy of God you didn't win out. You see, there was just the one of us who was liable to recognize you, whatever way you twisted your face, and that was Dick Hannay. I give you good marks for Clarence. For the rest, I had you beaten flat." He looked steadily at him. "You don't believe it? Well, I'll give you proof. I've been watching your underground railway for quite a time. I've had my men on the job, and I reckon most of the lines are now closed for repairs. All but the trunk line into France. That I'm keeping open, for soon there's going to be some traffic on it." At that I saw Ivery's eyelids quiver. For all his self-command, he was breaking. "I admit we cut it mighty fine, along of your fooling me about Clarence. But you struck a bad snag in General Hannay, Graf. Your heart-to-heart talk with him was poor business. You reckoned you had him safe, but that was too big a risk to take with a man like Dick, unless you saw him cold before you left him. He got away from this place, and early this morning I knew all he knew. After that it was easy. I got the telegram you had sent this morning in the name of Clarence Dunn, and it made me laugh. Before midday I had this whole outfit under my hand. Your servants have gone by the underground railway to France. Ehrlich, well, I'm sorry about Ehrlich." I knew now the name of the Portuguese Jew. "He wasn't a bad sort of man," Blenkiron said regretfully, "and he was plumb honest. I couldn't get him to listen to reason, and he would play with firearms. So I had to shoot." "Dead?" asked Ivery sharply. "Yes. I don't miss, and it was him or me. He's under the ice now, where you wanted to send Dick Hannay. He wasn't your kind, Graf, and I guess he has some chance of getting into heaven. If I weren't a hard-shell Presbyterian, I'd say a prayer for his soul." I looked only at Ivery. His face had gone very pale, and his eyes were wandering. I am certain his brain was working at lightning speed, but he was a rat in a steel trap, and the springs held him. If ever I saw a man going through hell, it was now. His pasteboard castle had crumbled about his ears, and he was giddy with the fall of it. The man was made of pride, and every proud nerve of him was caught on the raw. "So much for ordinary business," said Blenkiron. "There's the matter of a certain lady. You haven't behaved over-nice about her, Graf, but I'm not going to blame you. You maybe heard a whistle blow when you were coming in here? No? Why, it sounded like Gabriel's trump. Peter must have put some lung power into it. Well, that was the signal that Miss Mary was safe in your car, but in our charge. Do you comprehend?" He did. The ghost of a flush appeared in his cheeks. "You ask about General Hannay? I'm not just exactly sure where Dick is at the moment, but I opine he's in Italy." I kicked aside the screen, thereby causing Amos almost to fall on his face. "I'm back," I said, and pulled up an armchair and dropped into it. I think the sight of me was the last straw for Ivory. I was a wild enough figure, grey with weariness, soaked, dirty, with the clothes of the porter Joseph Zimmer in rags from the sharp rocks of the Schwarzsteintor. As his eyes caught mine they wavered, and I saw terror in them. He knew he was in the presence of a mortal enemy. "Why, Dick," said Blenkiron with a beaming face, "this is mighty opportune. How in creation did you get here?" "I walked," I said. I did not want to have to speak, for I was too tired. I wanted to watch Ivory's face. Blenkiron gathered up his patience cards, slipped them into a little leather case, and put it in his pocket. "I've one thing more to tell you. The wild birds have been summoned home, but they won't ever make it. We've gathered them in. Pavia and Hofgaard and Conradi. Ehrlich is dead. And you are going to join the rest in our cage." As I looked at my friend, his figure seemed to gain in presence. He sat square in his chair with a face like a hanging judge, and his eyes, sleepy no more, held Ivory as in a vice. He had dropped, too, his drawl and the idioms of his ordinary speech, and his voice came out hard and massive like the clash of granite blocks. "You're at the bar now, Graf von Schwabing. For years you've done your best against the decencies of life. You have deserved well of your country, I don't doubt it. But what has your country deserved of the world? One day soon Germany has to do some heavy paying, and you are the first installment." "I appeal to the Swiss law. I stand on Swiss soil, and I demand that I be surrendered to the Swiss authorities." Ivory spoke with dry lips, and the sweat was on his brow. "Oh, no, no," said Blenkiron soothingly. "The Swiss are a nice people, and I would hate to add to the worries of a poor little neutral state. All along both sides have been outside the law in this game, and that's going to continue. We've abode by the rules, and so must you. For years you've murdered and kidnapped and seduced the weak and ignorant, but we're not going to judge your morals. We leave that to the Almighty when you get across Jordan. We're going to wash our hands of you as soon as we can. You'll travel to France by the Underground Railway, and there be handed over to the French government. For what I know, they've enough against you to shoot you every hour of the day for a 12-month. I think he had expected to be condemned by us there and then, and sent to join Ehrlich beneath the ice. Anyhow, there came a flicker of hope into his eyes. I dare say he saw some way to dodge the French authorities if he once got a chance to use his miraculous wits. Anyhow, he bowed with something very much like self-possession and asked permission to smoke. As I have said, the man had his own courage. "Blenkiron," I cried, "we're going to do nothing of the kind." He inclined his head gravely toward me. "What's your notion, Dick?" "We've got to make the punishment fit the crime," I said. I was so tired that I had to form my sentences laboriously, as if I were speaking a half-understood foreign tongue. "Meaning?" "I mean that if you hand him over to the French, he'll either twist out of their hands somehow, or get decently shot, which is far too good for him. This man and his kind have sent millions of honest folk to their graves. He has sat spinning his web like a great spider, and for every thread there has been an ocean of blood spilled. It's his sort that made the war, not the brave, stupid, fighting Boche. It's his sort that's responsible for all the clotted beastliness, and he's never been in sight of a shell. I'm for putting him in the front line. No, I don't mean any Uriah the Hittite business. I want him to have a sporting chance, just what other men have. But by God, he's going to learn what is the upshot of the strings he's been pulling so merrily. He told me in 2 days' time Germany would smash our armies to hell. He boasted that he would be mostly responsible for it. Well, let him be there to see the smashing." "I reckon that's just," said Blenkiron. Ivory's eyes were on me now, fascinated and terrified, like those of a bird before a rattlesnake. I saw again the shapeless features of the man in the tube station, the residuum of shrinking mortality behind his disguises. He seemed to be slipping something from his pocket towards his mouth, but Geordie Hamilton caught his wrist. "What you offer?" said the scandalized voice of my servant. "Sir, the prisoner would appear to be trying to poison himself." Will I search him?" After that he stood with each arm in the grip of a warder. "Mr. Ivery," I said, "last night, when I was in your power, you indulged your vanity by gloating over me. I expected it, for your class does not breed gentlemen. We treat our prisoners differently, but it is fair that you should know your fate. You are going into France, and I will see that you are taken to the British front. There, with my old division, you will learn something of the meaning of war. Understand that by no conceivable chance can you escape. Men will be detailed to watch you day and night, to see that you undergo the full rigor of the battlefield. You will have the same experience as other people, no more, no less. I believe in a righteous God, and I know that sooner or later you will find death at the hands of your own people, an honourable death which is far beyond your deserts. But before it comes you will have understood the hell to which you have condemned honest men." In moments of great fatigue, as in moments of great crisis, the mind takes charge and may run on a track independent of the will. It was not myself that spoke, but an impersonal voice which I did not know, a voice in whose tones rang a strange authority. Ivery recognized the icy finality of it, and his body seemed to wilt and droop. Only the hold of the warders kept him from falling. I, too, was about at the end of my endurance. I felt dimly that the room had emptied except for Blenkiron and Amos, and that the former was trying to make me drink brandy from the cup of a flask. I struggled to my feet with the intention of going to Mary, but my legs would not carry me. I heard as in a dream Amos giving thanks to an omnipotence in whom he officially disbelieved. "What's that old man in the Bible said? 'Now let thou thy servant depart at peace.' That's the way I'm feeling myself." And then slumber came on me like an armed man, and in the chair by the dying wood ash I slept off the ache of my limbs, the tension of my nerves, and the confusion of my brain. End of Chapter 19.